second presentation in the follow-up to Hermetic America. This second series is cognate. It's Hermetic America Future. One of the peculiarities that we have become acquainted with and sustained in our inquiry is that time as a flow occurs within a field without limit. So that time as a dimension is actually a linearity, pure, of one dimension, out of which blossoms the three dimensions of space. That four-dimensional continuum, then, occurs with the timeline, and even though existentials in space then occur and emerge, and through a polarization they cinch themselves into phenomenality, the actual fact is that that flow of space-time continues to occur within a field without limit. So that ancient wisdom used to style it as the succession of days amounting to millions of years, day by day, linking up, becoming the cycles of time, and carrying with it in those cycles of time all of the phenomena that have spatiality, that have polarized and cinched themselves into existentiality, but that all of this occurs as a time stream within eternity. And that a special quality of our species was to be able to give ourselves a sense of the present moment, so that the quality of focusing exactly became a hallmark of a new kind of species of Homo, improved from Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis. Now we know of Homo floresiensis. Homo sapiens were able to have a sense of the present. And they came into species about 200,000 years ago. But even speaking about that, we did not know that there were origins of our species 200,000 years ago until just a few years ago. So that the future in this timeline is constantly illuminating and making more specific the past in such a way that the past continues now to morph and to transform, and so I call it the new past. So that the future and the new past occur together, rippling out, but rippling out initially for our species out of a sense of the present, so that the language, oral language, origins of our species, Homo sapiens, had the ability to tell stories that would have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these became the stories that then established the mythos, the mythic horizon of language that could evoke feelings and images, and that species mutated about 50,000 years ago. And the mutation of our species 50,000 years ago added a further dimensioning to space-time. The mythic present that then would extend to the gods and goddesses of the upper world and the lower world, of the context surrounding our present in the flow of time-space, 50,000 years ago, the added dimension of a differential consciousness modified our species so that it now technically is given the name Homo sapiens sapiens, doubling it, meaning not just wise men, but wise about being wise. And we have talked about this. The added dimension was the ability to access the context of the continuum of space-time, which we had always considered to be the mystery of nature, and now it was the field of a differential consciousness, the ability to vision, and out of this came two qualities that transformed in a braided way the flow of space-time. One of the qualities was the process of remembering. The other was the quality of the process of creative imagining. So that the images of the mythic horizon that registered in symbolic thought as the imagination became fluid again in a new way. And it was like adding a fifth dimension. And so the imagination as a structure in symbolic thought phased itself into a new flow. But this flow had a different time sense. Instead of having a present, it had a presence. And the quality that came with that was the ability to abstract oneself out of the limitations of nature, of the nature cycle, out of the continuum of space-time and its seasons, and to add a fifth quality to it. This was the beginning of wisdom. That one can literally be outside of time, outside of space, in a quality of transcendental presence. And one finds immediately the evidence of this because art begins to appear for the first time in the life record of this planet. Paleolithic civilization was being born. We live in a time now which for the last 2,000 years has been preparing a further transformation, a further refinement. And the process that is directing that refinement is the process of history rather than the process of visionary consciousness or the mythic horizon of language. So there are three different processes that one needs to keep in mind here like a rule of thumb. One is the process of myth, which results in symbolic thought as a form. The second is the process of visioning differential consciousness, which results in art forms. And the third is history, which is a kind of a kaleidoscopic conscious flow, differential in its own way. And what registers as the form of history is the cosmos itself. So that we have a very interesting quality. For the last 2,000 years, the historical consciousness has begun to gain a kind of seventh dimension quality to it, so that the cosmos really will become like an eight-dimensional form. Out of this, time began to have a different condensation to it. It became condensed, and it also became increasingly differential. so that it became focusable more and more to not only a single pointedness, but to the vanishing point, so that the present moment would literally vanish into the quality of presence, and that quality of personal presence, which had already transcended the present moment, the time flow of a mythos, now was deepening and widening at the same time, expanding and becoming ever more honed, laser-like, so that the historical conscious process began to reveal 2,000 years ago the ability to condense the past newer and newer into a power of revelation, and that the future became more and more able to be discerned and to be cognate with this condensing of the past. In our time, in the 1940s, a tremendous push in the distilling refinement of history came to pass, focused here in the United States. The outstanding work of that time was collected together. The short stories of Robert Heinlein, who began writing and publishing in 1940, and they're collected together, The Past Through Tomorrow. And all these stories collected in this volume are Heinlein's Future History series. That this is where we are going to go, and these are stories of that future history, and they go all the way out into space travel, into the cosmos, so that the cosmos is revealed by the visitation of persons, largely American-style persons. And this gives us a modern version of what 2,000 years ago came into play in a powerful way and was called apocalyptic. In an interview, one of the great Hermetic Americans, James H. Charlesworth, who is the head at Princeton University of many aspects there. He's the Collard Professor of New Testament Language and Literature, but he runs many different kinds of colloquia. In a recent interview posted on Google, he was asked what was an apocalypse, and he replied, "An apocalypse, well, it is writing that claims to disclose hidden secrets either by taking an individual literally into the heavens above or into the future and then bringing the person back to explain what he has seen or experienced. The function then is to explain the meaning of the present and the meaning of suffering by going to another world and another time and then coming back and explaining it." And then the great example of what an apocalypse is the book of Revelation that closes out the Bible, that closes out the New Testament, the apocalypse of John, of St. John. Exactly in 1940, the apocalyptic going out into another time, into another world, was the realization that the smallest structure of phenomenality could be explored and divided, that one could break the atom. And in breaking the atom, a tremendous amount of energy would be released, and it was the beginning of the differential conscious vision that it was possible to have an atomic bomb. It took about 3 years for the Manhattan program to actually be started. But this vision came from a lot of individuals working in Europe, but the focus of it was to bring all of this to the United States, and the person who received that was Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. Not only because he was the great leader of the United States, but he was seen as the most creative, transformative person on the planet in a time of increasing crisis. The Second World War had broken out in September 1939, so that right at the beginning, 1940 was a crisis moment in world history. The day I was born, October 14th, 1940, was the day that Einstein became an American citizen. He had come previously, and he had been contacted in 1940 by Niels Bohr out of Copenhagen in Denmark to put a letter jointly before Franklin Roosevelt that it was obvious that an atomic bomb could be built, that weapons of atomic destruction could be made, and that this was going to make warfare terminal. There would be no victors. Niels Bohr's great statement was, the world needs to be open now permanently. We can no longer have a closed world, and that a closed world is the projection of a closed mind. So that what is necessary now is for the mind of the public to be permanently opened to the visionary capacity that has previously been the purview of only talented few. Almost exactly at the same time that this was happening, a publication happened in Rome at the Pontificum Institutum Biblicum, the Pontifical Institute in Rome, which is the Jesuit order institute that keeps track and has kept track for 500 years almost of all of the developments pertaining to Christianity, to the Roman Christian Church, to the power of the Church to carry itself through a timeline of authority. And in 1940, a great Hermetic American, Cyrus Gordon, published a manual of translating out of the recently discovered language Ugaritic. Ugarit had been found in what is today the border coast between Lebanon and Syria, found in 1929, and the French, who were prominent in that part of the world, went into the archaeology of Ugarit, and they found tablets written in what was immediately seen as the ancient language of cuneiform, except that it had a transform to it. It was alphabetic rather than pictorial. Instead of being hieroglyphic, it was alphabetic. And it was the first time that we had found the origins of an alphabet. And that this happened about 2000 BC. But that it reached an apex around the 1300s BC, the 14th century BC. And that apex coincided exactly with the arrival of the survivors of the Exodus from Egypt led by Moses, whose leadership was given over to Joshua because the old Moses died. He died within sight of the Holy Land, but was not allowed to go over into it. He died on the top of Mount Nebo, proverbially 120 years old. And it was Joshua then who took the people who had been born during the Exodus in that 40 years, because the original generation that left were inculcated into a mythos which they could not change. And the transform of the next generation was incomplete, and so it had to be a grandchild generation that completed the transformation and no longer had the old mythos, but had a new mythos, and the new mythos was given a symbolic structure called the Torah. And the 5 books of the Torah founds the Bible, founds the Old Testament. So just exactly at the time that Ugaritic as a language was at the apex of its expressive power, the Jews come back into the Holy Land, and when they come back into the Holy Land, they have to fight the people who are there, and reclaiming that land, reclaiming because they had been given that land some 800 years before in the time of Abraham, and so you begin to have a great confluence of things. In 1940, when the first Ugaritic handbook came out, it was superseded by this collection of 3 in 1947, and Cyrus Gordon says that the advances, despite the Second World War, have been so immense that a new edition had to be brought out in 3 volumes, 1947, and it was apparent by then that the Ugaritic mythology was taken over largely by the Jews coming back in, so that there was a quality not only of the Torah as a symbolic form, but there was a previous quality of mythos that was not just tribal, but had been developed for more than 1,000 years before by a previous civilization, and that this engendered a whole visionary imagery of another world, of another time. All of this became more and more apparent because when this came out in 1947 was exactly the time that the sound barrier was first broken, October 14th, 1947. Exactly at the time that the UFO crash in Roswell in late July had sunk in that there was something desperate going on that was being covered up. Also, the beginnings of the Cold War, the realization that what had been allies against the Axis powers in Europe, that the Americans and the Russians were in polarized camps, and that this would probably go into an atomic stalemate, which it did by 1949. The qualities that are in this, and Cyrus Gordon, by the way, was born in 1908. He lived until 2001. He lived to be 93 years old. He was born in Philadelphia. He was given a rare kind of education. He was from an upper-class Jewish family in Philadelphia. He was given entrance into a lot of special places, like the University of Pennsylvania, Dropsy College, and so forth. And finally, Cyrus Gordon realized that he had an ability, a penchant, to learn not only ancient languages and modern languages, but he had the ability to decode. Later on, during the Second World War, he headed up the code-breaking department of the United States military because he understood how to read from scratch whatever was being presented and that a lot of the early German codes, for instance, used Old Persian, or they used Arabic. The Americans, for code, used Navajo. They were languages that if somebody was acquainted with, it was easy to break their codes. And so Gordon became one of those figures. He also began to realize that the language flows that had come together in New Testament times, starting about around 280 BC and running from there into the first century, early second century AD, the two languages that really were powerful in making that transform were Hebrew and Greek. And that Hebrew and Greek had a common origin. They had a common origin in Ugaritic. And that Ugaritic was, in fact, the world's first alphabetical written version of a North Semitic language called Akkadian, and that Akkadian was a refinement, an expanded refinement of an even older language, Sumerian. And one of the great figures, another Hermetic American, Samuel Noah Kramer, became the world expert. Even though he was born in Russia, he was brought to the United States at age 9, and all his long, productive life, he was one of the great figures. In my learning civilization, I use his translation with with Diane Volkstein of the Inanna epics. And he also edited mythologies of the ancient world and about a dozen or so other books. Interesting, one of his little pamphlets published in Philadelphia, and March 1948, University Museum Bulletin on Iraqi excavations, the American excavations in Iraq. And this was published in 1948, just shortly after the Ugaritic handbook of Cyrus Gordon. What is interesting here is that increasingly we will see today that there are a dozen or two of the major transformers of the biblical tradition who were Hermetic Americans. They constituted a group of geniuses that over the last 140 years, 100 years especially, have transformed what was at one time the Bible into a whole range, a kaleidoscopic range of historical perspective and spectrum, so that it is no longer just the Bible is something that someone will swear on in a court of law, but it is a range of amplification of the historical understanding, not only of the cycle of nature, but of the cycle of conscious transforms as well, which is not a cycle, but an ecology. Because consciousness in its ecology returns not back to the beginning of the cycle, but returns the entire ecology and cycle back into like an infinity sign, into a Mobius strip, and that this, when it vibrates, creates exactly what is described in string theory. The little vibrations in string theory are echoes of the vibrations of eternity, recognized and realized and brought back into phenomenality in a transforming way. The original Hermetic American who began this, we talked about in the previous series, was Benjamin Franklin, who was never someone to go to a standardized church. He loved to go to hear good sermons, to hear great speakers. One of his closest friends was the great fundamentalist evangelist George Whitefield, who came over from England and drew such huge crowds in Philadelphia, 6,000 to 7,000 people. There was no place to put them, so the sermons were held out in the streets, Market Street, and most of Philadelphia from the time came to hear him, including Franklin, and they were great friends. But Franklin had stepped outside for the first time of having any indication that he was containable within a tradition, that he was identifiable within a mental form. And for him, it was the exploration of new things, the explorations of the capacities to open oneself up. And cognate with him at the same time, we talked about in the previous series, Jonathan Edwards, who finally, his genius, his ability to penetrate, to have a conscious visioning and an exact understanding of what was supposed to be scripture, but what was really an insight into human nature, into the mind's mysteries, into the visionary capacities of conscious realization, that he was locked out of his traditional church. Sent in exile to become a menial teacher at an Indian school in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, but whose works, when they were being published and printed by people like Benjamin Franklin, were read increasingly as being the greatest philosophic works by an American to date. And Edwards was selected to be the first great president at Princetown, now Princeton. Unfortunately for him, part of the difficulty of the times, there was an inoculation against smallpox, and it was not handled correctly, and instead of being protected, he got smallpox and died before he could even begin all of the changes he wanted to make in Princeton. Would have been colossal. 1758. At the time, Franklin was minister plenipotential in Europe, in England. The quality, though, that goes through them gets amplified, as we talked about, in Ralph Waldo Emerson, who also could not stay a preacher. He could not stay in the great second church, Unitarian church in Boston, and in fact never again wanted to give a sermon, and instead took to writing essays. And it's the essays of Emerson that are not secular, they're mysteriously more conscious than a religion sermon would be. And one of his great addresses was he went to Harvard Divinity School to talk to the senior class, July 15th, 1838. And he says to them in the address, "Let us now do what we can to rekindle the smoldering, nigh quenched fire on the altar. The evils of the church that now is are manifest. The question returns, what shall we do? I confess all attempts to project and establish a cultus with new rites and forms seems to me vain. Faith makes us and not we it, and faith makes its own forms. All attempts to contrive a system are as cold as the new worship introduced by the French to the goddess of reason, today pasteboard and filigree, and ending tomorrow in madness and murder." All of this came to a re-pressurized focus during the Civil War in the United States, held by the prismatic personality of Abraham Lincoln. And right at the end of the war, in August 27th, 1865, was born one of the great Hermetic American theologians, James Henry Breasted, who lived until 1935. And it was Breasted, he was born in Rockford, Illinois, but was largely educated, as people in northern Illinois or southern Wisconsin would be, in Chicago. He went to the original Northwestern College, and from there he began to develop himself in such a way that he took his MA at Yale, then he took a PhD in Berlin, and he was the first American to have a PhD in theology. Not a THD, but a PhD. He was a teaching, researching master of the literature of religion, and his first great feat was to collect in 5 volumes and publish it in 1906. He was at the time 41 years old. Ancient Records of Egypt, historical documents, which is still in print to this day, and many of the documents have never had to receive another translation. It's still usable, the 5 volumes from 1906 from Breasted. His capacity at the University of Chicago was to take a museum that was there at the place, at the school, and to find a way to expand it and deepen it so that eventually, after the First World War was over in 1919, John D. Rockefeller gave enough money to found the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Breasted is one of those individuals who is larger than the life of Indiana Jones. Here's a photograph of him in 1906 with his wife and his young son, Charles, in Egypt. And Breasted, while he was there, began collating the archaeological finds with the manuscript texts that were coming out, and all of this led to an increasing understanding that what we had was a completely new past that had not been fully appreciated or understood since about 2,000 years ago. That 2,000 years ago takes us back to the time of Jesus, back to the time of Mary Magdalene, and that first century AD was the last time that a comprehensive understanding of the previous histories and the future visions were brought together in the jewels of kaleidoscopically historical alert human beings. And the last human being of that whole time period was St. John. He died in 101 AD in Ephesus. We're going to take a break and come back for more. Let's come back, and we're braiding 2 themes. We're braiding the future in a visionary way, and we're braiding the past in a transformed way. And that these 2, when they braid, they make an interchange that looks like an ongoing infinity sign. And that ongoing infinity sign, if put on a staff, will be the 2 serpents that weave the caduceus, which is the symbol of Hermes. And Hermes' symbol, then, is an ancient way of expressing that time will weave in pairs because it is phenomenally polarized, but that it has the capacity to transform at interchange nodes. And at those interchange nodes, there are accesses to the context, the background, the eternal field within which the braiding of time cycles occurs. And the nodes will occur because one has added conscious dimensions to space-time. And as they now, instead of just flowing like a mythos, they will intertwine like the caduceus of the Hermetic symbol. And these two energy snakes will give a expansion to the rod. And so the rod with the snake energy was originally the symbol of a prophet who can heal, and the double snakes with the rod is a symbol of a historical personage who can teach. The original story that the Bible has of the rod which can be turned into a snake is that that was a capacity that Moses had before Pharaoh in Egypt to show that he had come from the Lord. The turning of the rod into the snake was also an ancient symbol of Asclepios, the god of healing, who originally in ancient Egypt, we know now because of archaeology, was named Imhotep. And he is not only the archetypal physician, he's the archetypal architect as well. He's the first to have made a true pyramid in the time of Zoser in the third dynasty of Egypt some 4,700 years ago. The ability to expand healing to teaching, an architecture of phenomenality in the world to an architecture of noumenality in the heavens, is the transform that came from Moses to Jesus. Jesus is a healer, but he is even more primordial, even more expansive, a teacher. He is capable of having phenomenal architecture of communities, of persons, of the individual become a person, but has the ability to expand that so that there is a cosmic architecture of reality that is available. All of this became increasingly, especially in Hermetic America over the last 300 years, a cause for deep experiment. While there always have been utopian-like communities, the United States especially has had more utopian community experiences and experiments. And in fact, Hermetic America as a whole is the great experiment. It's the great utopian community. It takes for its purview the entirety of humanity. Everyone is not only welcomed as an immigrant from anywhere, but is also welcome to participate with the indigenous Native American population as well. And when the original colonists came in the early 1600s, they felt that This was a very special kind of people. They were not considered savage at first. They were considered a very special kind of humanity that went back to primordiality. And the great example of it was the bringing of a chieftain's princess daughter, Pocahontas, to London, where she was bedecked and festooned in great Elizabethan dress and was the hit of the age. She was a primordial woman from the Americas who was able to conduct herself like a Princess Diana of the time. She was on everyone's lips that it is not that they are savage, it is that they are primordial. And that was the beginnings of it. Later on, through the interchanges that went astray and were skewed, it became that Indians are either tame or they're savage. But the truth is that they were primordial. And this ability to go into primordiality, to rediscover that primordiality, was like going to another time, going to another world. And so a lot of the European apocalyptic became transformed in the United States into a primordiality, an apocalyptic of not in terms of something that is going to happen, but in terms of what is now happening within us, to us. And we live at a time where this has been accelerated immensely. We've talked this morning about the fact that Hermetic Americans have become, over the last 140 years, some of the most incredible figures in transforming the Bible, transforming the Old Testament and the New Testament into a completely new understanding of the origins. And one of the things that one of the people we mentioned, Professor James H. Charlesworth, one of his great collections, this is volume 1 of 2 volumes. It collects all of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, 65 documents that have been found and now translated into English and put together in such a way that one can read things like the Testament of Solomon, or one can read the Sibylline oracles, or one can read the books of Enoch. And Charlesworth, in fact, was the founder of the Enoch seminar at Princeton and still carrying it on. The important thing is that the earliest Jewish apocalypse actually is the book of Enoch, which was written about 200 BC. Enoch is taken from the earth. He's taken into the netherworld and into the upper world and shown the apocalyptic possibilities that are the true context of earthly life. And it is this that gives the power to the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that in between them is a gap of about 200 years. And in that gap of about 200 years is a translational, transform literature that eventually culminates in the person, the differential conscious person of Jesus. And what he does as that condensed person at the node of transformative time is to provide a living presence to the intersection, so that at that particular node of nodes, there's an exponential, realizable transform, and exponential because it is not just the single transform, it is the double transform all at the same time. The fermentation and the distillation at the same time. The water becomes wine, the wine becomes cognac, all at the same time. It is an explosive double transform moment that creates then what was called at the time, in the 1st century AD, a thrice greatest world, a trismegistic world, and that the teacher of the approach to that world was Hermes Trismegistus. And Hermes Trismegistus then is the exemplar of a conscious ecology transform of the cycles of nature, so that eternity is revealed not just in a glimpse, but as in a portal by which one can go through and never have to return to a world of illusion again. Never have to come back to a mind of disillusionment again. That this is not just a permanent, but it is a real life. The ability to look at Enoch, by the way, the great ongoing translation, he's been working at it for over 40 years, is by George Nicholsburg Jr. He holds out in Iowa, the University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. And there in Iowa City, Iowa, at the University of Iowa, which has beautiful old buildings and beautiful old trees like elm trees, he's been doing the ultimate translation and annotation of the books of Enoch. And the first was published a couple of 3, 4, 5 years ago. And the second volume will be the very special part of the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch has 5 basic parts written over a series of times, and parts 1, 3, 4, and 5 have been put together in the first of Nicholsburg's volume. Part 2 has a separate volume for itself because it is the most amazing revelatory part of that. It was not written in 200 BC or in 100 BC like some of the rest of it was. I have offered that it was written in the first waning years between 0 BC and 1 AD by Jesus' father Joseph, because it is all about the ability to vision and then teach the visioning in parables. And that second part of the book of Enoch has 3 parables. And the 3 parables cluster around the prismatic jewel idea of the Son of Man. And Jesus always referred to himself as the Son of Man. That man is established, but there is such a thing as a refinement of man. Not just in a next generation, but in the next generationable mankind. And that next generational mankind is what we are now emerging as, not just as Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, but as Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man. And that this is a distillation of what Homo sapiens sapiens were for the last 50,000 years, which in itself was a great transform by fermentation of art from what the species had been for 150,000 years, which in itself was a transformation of species of Homo, like Homo erectus is 2 million years old. Homo habilis goes back almost 3 million years. So that our rainbow of species is undergoing exactly at this time, in this particular series of a couple of generations, transform into a civilization that is star system wide, that is at home on the interstellar frontier. One of the primordial documents that occurs along with the book of Enoch is the Pistis Sophia, the book of faith wisdom, written somewhere around, originally around 110 AD, translated and recopied all during the 2nd century and early 3rd century AD. In the book of faith wisdom, there are ways in which the teaching goes by exemplar, and the exemplars are to take a sacred hymn which then is opened up into the kaleidoscopic understanding of how it is really historical based upon the field of visionary consciousness. It's like a textbook of showing how this is done, and it's done over and over again. And the examples in the book of faith wisdom number into the scores. Most of those sacred hymns are psalms, psalms of David, but 5 of them are psalms called Odes of Solomon. And it is the Odes of Solomon which were recovered about 1909, about the time that a number of transforms were being generated in the world. And it is Charles Worth, as a young divinity student at Duke University, who discovered that the Odes of Solomon in their 42 hymns are the oldest Christian hymnal. He eventually published his dissertation. Oxford University Press published it in 1973, and he's done many different studies on it since then. My work has shown that the most likely author of that collection was Mary Magdalene. And when one looks at that in a kaleidoscopic way, one comes to understand that we have been living in an extraordinary apocalyptic time, especially for the last 110, 120 years. And that the trigger of that particular apocalyptic visioning, the initial example of it was H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, published in 1895. Published exactly at the same time that what was being discovered was that there are invisible energies. We don't know what they are, and so they were called X-rays. And this was the beginning of the penetration of the atom that is not just a hard little thing, but is instead an ensemble of energy receiving and emitting. And that because it is an ensemble of receiving and emitting, it must have a working part quality, must have parts. And this is what led, finally, we talked about this morning, to the discovery by 1940 that it is possible through special interference with the structure of the atom at accessible point that one can release tremendous energies. And of course the release would come within about 5 years with the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. We're trying to understand how from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, within 17 years you had the publication by Edgar Rice Burroughs of A Princess of Mars. It was a Under the Moons of Mars, Argosy magazine, 1912. This is the apocalyptic vision of taking an Earthman and taking him to Mars and having him understand that he was actually a prince of that new planet, whereas he had just been a soldier on Earth. The ordinary man became the fighting man of Mars, who won the princess of the major city of Helium. And so he became then the most outstanding figure on Mars and was able to learn the wisdom of Mars as well by going to the old, ancient, rarely visited wizards of Mars. And it's very similar to the ability for Hermetic Americans to go to Native American shaman and to understand that there is a primordiality. They're not simply old people. They're not simply have been here a long time. They are primordial in the sense that they have had an access to eternity that was forgotten by a cover-up civilization. And one of the qualities of Edgar Rice Burroughs is that before he became a science fiction writer, he was a cowboy. He actually wrote Westerns, actually could ride and rope with the rest of them, and founded here in Los Angeles Tarzana. That was his ranch. And so Los Angeles became one of the focuses for science fiction writers. It became like a mecca for this visionary apocalyptic happening, and one of the leading figures was A.E. Van Vogt. Van Vogt, who was born in Manitoba, Canada, and who came to the United States about 1939 because he published the first science fiction story he ever wrote in an American science fiction magazine, Astounding. And this was in July of 1939. And it was called Black Destroyer. And so famous is the issue that the entire issue has been put out by Southern Illinois University Press as the exemplar of what a visionary science fiction magazine was putting out at the crux of the age, July 1939. 6 months later, in 1940, in October of 1940, Van Vogt published one of the greatest of all science fiction novels, Slan, also an Astounding. This is the first edition of Slan in hardcover. It was one of the first hardcover science fiction novels ever to be published. It was published in 1946. Slan has come out in many editions. This is the first British edition of Slan. There are leather-bound signed collectors versions of Slan, and it's quite interesting to see. This is with Richard Powers, another Hermetic American artist, and I'll bring in next week a lot of Richard Powers' work, which is extraordinary. He is like a Hermetic American explosion of Matisse, of Miro, of Yves Tanguy, into a cosmic amplification, a kaleidoscopic vision. I'll bring an original Richard Powers painting in next week as well. What is happening is that within less than 50 years, beginning with H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, you have the ability of science fiction apocalyptic visioning able to understand that we have a future history which is endless and meeting with incredible ranges of beings who are alive in a cosmos seething with differentiality, kaleidoscopically so. And one of the greatest of Van Vogt's novels is called The Voyage of the Space Beagle. And It was originally serialized in Astounding Science Fiction magazine in 1943, exactly at the time that the Manhattan Project was beginning in Los Alamos. This is the British first edition. Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle was the development of his entire science of evolution. The Voyage of the Space Beagle is the development of an endless transformation of mankind and other species into a ever increasing cosmos. The end of The Voyage of the Space Beagle tells the tale. The protagonist is in a new science that is not able to be named, and so it is called in the novel Next. And nexialism. And carrying its little bit of human civilization, the expeditionary ship Space Beagle sped at an ever-increasing velocity through a night that had no end and no beginning. And at the end of the Voyage of the Space Beagle, the ship carrying 1,000 scientists and explorers and persons is leaving the galaxy, going across the incredible gulf to the next great galaxy, Andromeda, 2.2 million light years away. Our apocalypse is able to have, increasingly, by the time of the 1940s, the ability to look at ranges of humanity that would not have been possible even to imagine a couple of generations before. One of the great science fiction visions, exactly at the time of Heinlein and Van Vogt, was Isaac Asimov, and the first of a trilogy was called Foundation, and the second was called Foundation and Empire, and the third was called Second Foundation. That there is an individual named Harry Seldon who has died a long time ago, but who has left these kaleidoscopic tapes that come to life just like a living holograph, and that he is able to teach. And what he teaches is that civilization that was once crumbled and fell, and it wasn't just a civilization in ancient times on this planet, it was a civilization that spanned the entire galaxy, which fell. And that the science of psychohistory was able to understand that it would take 30,000 years to bring galactic civilization back into being. However, with the right teaching, with the right coterie of seed-planted guides, that dark age could be shrunk down to just 1,000 years, 1 millennium. And that in 1 millennium, a new galactic civilization could be brought into being. And one of the things that stood in the way, always, is that civilizations engender empires just before they become free. And so to guard against the success of the foundation making the new civilization that will make a new empire, a second foundation secretly is put on the other side of the galaxy to braid with the original foundation, so that when the second foundation is discovered, the first foundation will remember why they were set up, and the empire will not occur. If you follow what I was saying earlier in the first half of this presentation, you can see this is an immense complexity that already was written, published, and out by the early 1940s. Heinlein's Future History series, Van Vogt's Voyage of the Space Beagle, and Slan, and a number of other classics, Asimov's Foundation trilogy, which he expanded later to 7 novels. And just before he died, there was a contract signed with 3 of the younger science fiction writers to write even 3 more versions of Foundation novels that would open up without end. So there are about 10 Foundation novels now by 4 different writers, much like the science fiction classic Dune has had so many sequels. Frank Herbert himself wrote half a dozen of them. His son and another writer wrote another half dozen, versions upon versions, because this is a future history which is kaleidoscopic. It does not follow a single timeline. It follows multiple timelines so that there are multiple spaces that occur, and that the architecture for a kaleidoscopic space is a jewel form. And that jewel form has a prismatic capacity, and that the human individual that transforms into the art of the spirit person becomes like a jewel. And that history is the kaleidoscopic emanation of jewel beings. It is not about a past at all. It is about the future and the new past constantly presencing, so that a presence does not occur as a stopping point in phenomenal time, in phenomenal space. The whole point of an ultimate point is its ability to vanish and to immediately re-emerge fresh. Not a re-emergence so much, but an original emergence. That this next moment in time is just now new. It is not the same time that was there before. It is not the same phenomenal space there before. And you can see the great appeal in the 1940s for Zen. It was increasingly, especially in the United States, in Hermetic America, it was increasingly realized that what you have here is the ability to instantly be original with a continuity, because one can remember. And without the remembering function of the field of consciousness, if you think consciousness is an attribute of time-space or space-time, you miss the vanishing point. What you get is an idea of something that's in a phenomenal structure, limited by time, limited by space. Whereas consciousness is a field. It's not a quality of nature. It is exactly and precisely supernatural. So that freedom is a supernatural, realizable eternity. This quality of Hermetic America comes out more and more and more, especially when we look, as we have been looking, at the way in which the Bible has constantly been being changed. This little series of lectures, New Horizons in Biblical Research, William Foxwell Albright, published by Oxford University Press in 1966, but the lecture was given in 1961 in Toronto, Canada. And the very next year, in 1962, the lecture was by J. Robert Oppenheimer, The Flying Trapeze, 3 Crises for Physicists. This quality of insight gives us a glimpse into the way in which something so monolithic once upon a time as the Bible has become kaleidoscopic historically. Albright, by the way, was an extraordinary character. His people were also from Iowa, but his father was a Methodist minister and sent down to Chile, so that William Foxwell Albright, for the first 10 years of his life, was raised in Chile in various missions. His father was a Methodist minister. But he had poor eyesight. And once visiting an Iowa farm for the summer, he was unacquainted with farm equipment, and his hand was on a rope that was on a pulley, and the pulley maimed his hand. And so his left hand was maimed all his life. His ability to see was almost impaired all of his life. What he did was recursively to go into an inner world. And the first book that he ever bought, he was 10 years old, was a man named Professor Rogers, his excavations in Assyria and Babylonia. And at 10, started reading. And this became his life work for the next 70 years. Albright became one of these great figures in biblical archaeology. He was one of the founders. That it isn't just archaeology, but when you apply it to something like the Bible, you open it in this jewel-like way, and you come to realize not only did all of this happen a different way, but that what this reveals of ourselves is that we can transform in all those ways as well. That we were once a closed form, just like the Bible, and now it's opened up and has become a jewel of research that is able to disclose to ourselves, as in a magical mirror, the fact that we are any number of millions of images and creatively able to go beyond that. We're going to come back a little bit more next week. And some of the implications for Hermetic America in the 21st century is to make sure that the recursion back to empire does not happen. It's always there, very close. At the time of Jesus, the recursion occurred because it was not mitigated, and the Roman Empire came into being exactly at the same time. We face a situation now where a global empire is imminent, but a star system civilization is just as imminent. It simply requires a teacher. More next week.